Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Jawad Hami and these are the headlines. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says the withdrawal of foreign troops has provided an opportunity to end the conflict in Afghanistan. He was addressing the fourth virtual meeting of foreign ministers of Pakistan, China and Afghanistan. Qureshi said regional prosperity is linked with peace in the war-torn country. In Afghanistan, 4 people have been killed and as many others wounded when a bomb blast hit a van in Kabul. This comes days after 2 blasts targeting buses in the same area killed at least 12 people. Meanwhile, the Taliban claim to have killed 5 policemen and captured several security checkposts in the Badakhshan province. Pakistan says the international community must hold India accountable for its continuing crimes against the Kashmiri people. Foreign Ministry's statement comes after Indian forces martyred a youth in custody in the occupied Valley's Pulwama district. The occupying troops have martyred more than 325 civilians since the revocation of the Valley's autonomy in August 2019. EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell says the bloc is set to impose a new round of curbs on Myanmar's military and its economic interests. This will be the third batch of sanctions since the military ousted the government in February, sparking a wave of deadly protests. Meanwhile, envoys from ASEAN have arrived in Myanmar ahead of talks with the military on ending the months-long turmoil. India has registered over 134,000 coronavirus cases and almost 2,900 new deaths overnight. Pakistan has recorded 92 more COVID-19 deaths and over 2,000 cases in the past 24 hours. Meanwhile, global death toll has surpassed 3.6 million, while over 171 million have tested positive for the virus so far. And in sports, the Pakistan Cricket Board has announced the schedule for the remaining matches of the Pakistan Super League's 6th edition. The PCB said the matches will be played from 9th to 24th of June in Abu Dhabi. It added a total of 6 double headers will be played to finish the tournament by 24th of June. Those were the headlines and detailed stories. Right after a short break, stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says the withdrawal of foreign troops has provided an opportunity to end the conflict in Afghanistan. He was addressing the fourth virtual meeting of foreign ministers of Pakistan, China and Afghanistan. Qureshi said the drawdown of troops also creates a security challenge that needs to be addressed for a lasting peace. The foreign minister said regional prosperity is linked with peace in the war-torn country. He added that the 3 neighboring countries must work together to effectively deal with the current situation. Qureshi also called for bolstering a cooperation between the 3 countries against terrorism. Moving on, in Afghanistan, 4 people have been killed and as many others wounded when a bomb blast targeted a van in Kabul. Police say the casualties include women and children. This comes days after 2 blasts on buses killed 12 people in the same area. Meanwhile, the Taliban claim to have captured 7 security checkposts, including 5 policemen in Badakhshan province. The country has been witnessing a spate of targeted killings and deadly attacks amid withdrawal of foreign troops. The United Nations last month said nearly 1,800 civilians were killed or wounded in the first 3 months of the year. Pakistan says the international community must hold India accountable for its continuing crimes against the Kashmiri people. The Foreign Ministry's statement comes after Indian forces martyred a youth in custody in the occupied Valley's Pulwama district. In a weekly press briefing, spokesman Zahid Hafiz Chaudhary said Indian forces have repeatedly targeted Kashmiri youths through extrajudicial killings. He reiterated Islamabad's call for an independent probe into the killings of Kashmiris in fake encounters. He added, India is using rape and torture of Kashmiri women as instruments of state terrorism in the valley. Over 325 people have been killed and thousands others detained since India revoked the territory's autonomy in 2019. The EU says an agreement can be reached in the next round of talks held to revive the Iran nuclear deal. Meanwhile, Iran's negotiator Abbas Araghchi also says the next round is likely to be the final. EU envoy Enrique Mora told reporters in Vienna that some political and technical issues remain, but he said there are lesser issues than the last week and the parties are on a good track. Mora said the delegations from Russia, China, Germany, France, Britain, Iran and the US will return home. They will brief their governments and meet again in the Austrian capital next week. The United States has imposed sanctions on 3 Bulgarians and 64 companies over alleged corruption. The U.S. Treasury Department said the sanctions also hit oligarch Vasil Boskov, who was accused of supporting Russia against the Bulgarian government. The Treasury Department, in a statement, called the move its single biggest action to date against corruption. The curbs blocked the entities from accessing the U.S. financial system, freezing any of their U.S. assets. After sanctions, Bulgarian interim Prime Minister Stefan Yenev has assured Washington of fighting corruption together. The sanctions come before the July 11 snap parliamentary elections in Bulgaria and after massive anti-corruption protests in 2020. The European Union has announced a new round of sanctions on Myanmar's military junta and its economic interests. In an interview, EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell said the sanctions will be the third batch introduced since the military coup on February the 1st. He urged the military government to return to normal political behavior through free and fair elections. Since the coup, EU sanctions have frozen assets or applied travel bans on 21 military and civilian members of military's junta. But the Western pressure has yet to persuade the junta to restore democracy, with over 800 civilians killed in a brutal crackdown. Meanwhile, envoys from the Southeast Asian nations arrived in Myanmar ahead of planned meetings with the military. The U.S. has reiterated the commitment to help Saudi Arabia defend its territory and people. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin discussed regional security issues in a phone call with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. In a statement, Pentagon said both leaders particularly focused on efforts to end the war in Yemen. It said Austin thanked the Crown Prince for working with the U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, Tim Lenderking, to end the Yemen war. Austin also noted Saudi Arabia's recent successes in defeating the Houthi attacks on the kingdom. Meanwhile, UN Security Council will meet this week to discuss a long-abandoned fuel tanker off Yemen coast seized by the Houthis. Israeli opposition parties have reached an agreement to form a new government ending Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's 12-year tenure. Opposition leader Yair Lapid announced the formation of an 8-faction coalition just before the deadline on Wednesday midnight. In a tweet, Lapid said he has informed President Reuven Rivlin of the deal. Lapid was tasked to form the government after Netanyahu failed to put together a coalition following Israel's 4th election in less than 2 years. Under a rotation arrangement, right-wing Yamina Party's head, Naftali Bennett, would serve as Prime Minister first before handing over to Lapid. However, the agreement still needs to be voted on in the Knesset, where it requires a majority support before the government can be sworn in. If the coalition fails to win a majority, there is a risk of the country having to go to elections for the 5th time. Israel's defense chief Benny Gantz is set to travel to the U.S. to seek $1 billion for the replenishment of Iron Dome air defense system. This comes in the wake of an 11-day escalation between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, killing over 250 Palestinians. Israel's defense ministry said Gantz would meet U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and other security officials for a discussion on the issue. Meanwhile, Gaza director of the UN Refugees Agency has been called in for consultation after his controversial comments. Protests erupted over Matthias Shamel's interview, in which he said he didn't dispute Israel's assertion that its airstrikes were precise. Earlier, the Israeli army said it arrested a senior Hamas leader, Sheikh Jamal al-Tawil, in the West Bank, accusing him of setting up a base. The World Health Organization has warned of staggering health needs in Palestine after last month's Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. The WHO's regional office said it is scaling up its response to provide health aid for almost 200,000 Palestinians in need. In a statement, the WHO called for unhindered access for humanitarian and development-related supplies into Gaza as the situation there is volatile. Earlier, UN Refugees Agency in Gaza said Palestinians' forceful expulsions from their homes violates international law. It urged Israel to stop the forceful expulsions from the Sheikh Jarrah and other neighborhoods in the West Bank. The US says it is looking at a possible retaliation from Russia after it linked Moscow to a cyber attack against global meat processing giant JBS. The ransomware attack on Brazilian-owned firm has again prompted accusations that Russia harbors the cyber criminals.
Talking to reporters, President Joe Biden said Washington is closely monitoring the issue. The White House said Biden will raise the issue of cyber attacks with Russian President Vladimir Putin during the summit on 16th of June. At a news briefing, Press Secretary Jen Psaki reiterated that responsible states do not harbor cyber criminals. Psaki added Washington believes that Moscow has a role to play in preventing these cyber attacks. Earlier, the FBI attributed the ransomware attack to a Russian cyber criminal group named Revil. In a statement, the agency said it is working diligently to bring the threat actors to justice. Meanwhile, JBS says it has resumed a majority of its global operations, including in the US and Australia.
Moving on, India has registered over 134,000 coronavirus cases and almost 2,900 deaths overnight. Meanwhile, the global death toll has surpassed 3.6 million, with more than 171 million infections so far. More in this report.
In the fight against the coronavirus, rich countries with enormous sources fared better, while the poor mostly remained at the mercy of global relief agencies. India's government has inked a deal with domestic vaccine maker Biological E for 300 million doses, the first such order for unapproved shots. This comes as a second wave continues to devastate India, claiming thousands of lives every day. In Nepal, climbers returning from Mount Everest are struggling to find a flight back home after the country banned most air travel. The International Labour Organization says at least 220 million people are expected to remain unemployed globally this year, exacerbating existing inequalities.
This new financing facility will allow COVAX to rapidly acquire vaccines for sub-Saharan African countries under the cost-sharing scheme. Our efforts will also be boosted further by those donations from several governments, which will help accelerate equitable access through COVAX. And once again, I thank them for their generous contributions.
Meanwhile, dozens of countries and private donors pledged nearly $2.4 billion to the COVAX vaccine sharing plan. Meanwhile, after months of deliberations, U.S. President Joe Biden has finalized his plan to distribute millions of coronavirus vaccines worldwide. Pot-banging protests erupted across Brussels as President Jair Bolsonaro addressed the nation, just days after people took to the streets over his handling of the pandemic. Over in the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson says it is still unclear how protected the population will be against the new surge.
We've got to be so cautious because there's no question the ONS data of infection rates is showing an increase. We always knew that was going to happen. Don't forget, we always said that the unlocking steps that we've taken would lead to increases in infection.
Kuwait has approved GlaxoSmithKline and Vir Biotechnology's Sotrovimab as a treatment for coronavirus. Meanwhile, a new study has suggested that some COVID-19 survivors with persistent breathing symptoms have a condition called air trapping. Researchers say inhaled air gets stuck in the small airways of the lung and cannot be exhaled.
In Pakistan, 92 more people have died due to coronavirus over the past 24 hours. The health ministry says the country's death toll has topped 21,000. The ministry reported over 2,000 infections overnight, pushing the nationwide caseload above 926,000. There are currently over 3,600 critical cases in the country, while over 852,000 people have recovered from the virus so far. The ministry said more than 51,000 tests were conducted since yesterday. Meanwhile, the country has also started to schedule the coronavirus vaccination for those who are over 18 years old from today. 3 children have been killed and as many wounded in a hand grenade blast in the southwestern Quetta city of Pakistan. According to a Balochistan government spokesperson, the children mistook the grenade for a toy. Liaquat Shawani said the wounded have been transferred to a nearby hospital for treatment. Police have arrived at the scene and an investigation is underway. Pakistan has initiated a dialogue with the United Kingdom, Germany and Canada for the country's first nature bond. Prime Minister Imran Khan inaugurated the event on green financing innovations in Islamabad. Addressing the ceremony, Imran Khan said Pakistan's contribution to carbon emission is less than 1%. He said Pakistan is one of the top 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change and it needs to achieve a target of 10 billion trees. The Prime Minister added Pakistan will take the lead in the global efforts for environmental protection. During the event, the World Bank's Blue Carbon Study was presented for the first time, giving economic value to Pakistan's marine wealth. An MOU with China's Ilion Group was also signed for piloting green ecological zones in Pakistan. More stories to follow right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The U.S. envoy to the UN has visited the Turkish border with Syria and conveyed Washington's commitment to the Syrian people. The visit comes ahead of a showdown with Russia in the UN Security Council over the extension of a cross-border aid operation. Speaking to the media, Linda Thomas-Greenfield called for reopening of 2 other border crossings. The Security Council first authorized a cross-border aid operation into Syria at 4 points in 2014, but last year it reduced that access to 1 crossing point from Turkey due to opposition from Russia and China. Several council members, including the US, are pushing to expand the cross-border operation. Japan is expecting a snap election after the July 23 Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games. Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga has ordered not to extend the parliamentary session beyond June 16 when it comes to an end. The media reported the government is also considering producing a new economic stimulus package before the expected snap election. Tokyo will also not produce a supplementary budget, but instead tap on 4 trillion yen of reserves to spend on COVID-19 recovery. Slow vaccination rollout in Japan and Suga's continued push for the Games has greatly declined his popularity. Suga said he would focus on dealing with the pandemic and Japan will go ahead with the Games under strict virus protection measures. Two UN officials from the High Commissioner for Refugees have called on Bangladesh to provide education and jobs to Rohingya. They met Bangladesh Foreign Minister A.K. Abdul Momin on the last day of their 4-day official tour. Assistant High Commissioner for Protection Gillian Triggs said Rohingya children have no future without education. Triggs and UN's Assistant High Commissioner for Operations Rauf Mazou came to Bangladesh to assess and discuss the Rohingya issue. Both UN officials assured Dhaka they will work for the peaceful repatriation of Rohingya to their home country, Myanmar. However, they said the situation of Myanmar has been very difficult since the February 1st military coup. The International Criminal Court has asked Sudan to hand over one of the key people accused of war crimes and genocide in Darfur. Sudan's former president Omar Hassan Bashir and his 4 allies face charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. In a press briefing, Chief ICC Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda said Bashir, who is imprisoned in Sudan, is still wanted by the court. She said court is willing to negotiate with the Sudanese government on where his trial should be held. Bensouda said ICC investigators will travel to Darfur to continue speaking with victims of violence as crimes are still ongoing. The conflict in Sudan's western region killed an estimated 300,000 people and displaced 2.5 million others in 2002. Iran and the Central African Republic are in arrears on paying their dues to the UN's operating budget. In a letter, UN Chief Antonio Guterres said they will lose their voting rights in the General Assembly. Guterres told UNGA President Volkan Bozkır that 3 other African countries, including Somalia, are also in arrears, but he said the Assembly passed a resolution saying they can still vote in the current session, which ends in September. The UN Charter states members whose arrears equal or exceed the contributions due for 2 preceding years lose their voting rights. The minimum payments needed to restore voting rights are over $16 million for Iran and over $29 million for the Central African Republic. Denmark's parliament has passed a law allowing the country to relocate asylum seekers to countries outside Europe. The bill would allow Denmark to move refugees arriving on Danish soil to asylum seekers in a partner country. The law says that the asylum seekers would have their cases reviewed in the country they will be relocated to. They would have to submit an application in person at the Danish border and then be flown to an asylum center outside Europe. If the application is approved and the person is granted a refugee status, they would be given the right to live in the host country. But if the asylum request is rejected, the migrant would be asked to leave the host country. Denmark has one of Europe's toughest stances on immigration and has imposed tighter restrictions for disallowing further immigrations. In the U.S. state of Minneapolis, prosecutors have asked a judge to sentence the former police officer convicted of murdering George Floyd to 30 years in prison. The 45-year-old Derek Chauvin was convicted on April the 20th and was jailed immediately. Prosecutors in Minnesota made the request in court documents sent ahead of the June 25 sentence hearing. They called Chauvin's actions an abuse of his position, adding his conduct was particularly cruel. Meanwhile, Chauvin's lawyers countered with a far different request, seeking a sentence of time served and probation. Chauvin faces second-degree murder, which carries a maximum sentence of 40 years in prison. Floyd's death last year triggered the Black Lives Matter movement across the U.S. and around the world. Former U.S. President Donald Trump's blog page has been permanently removed from his website. The page, called From the Desk of Donald J. Trump, was launched last month after major social media platforms banned him. The page served as a way for Trump to publish his own content, including press releases and videos. In an interview, Trump aide Jason Miller said the page will not be returning, calling it just an auxiliary to the broader efforts. Miller said he does not have a precise awareness of timing, but hopes to have more information on efforts soon. A slew of social media platforms barred Trump following the Capitol Hill riots on January 6 that left 5 people dead. The massive sinkhole created in Santa Maria Zacatepec in Mexico's Puebla state is continuing to expand, worrying locals. The National Defense Ministry has reported that the sinkhole has a diameter of 60 meters wide and 15 meters deep. The residents and the local farmers have been asked to avoid the area of the hole. Local activists predict that the cause of the sinking may be the overexploitation of aquifers in the area. The explorations are done by the industrial parks working in the state. Local authorities have yet not given any further details. Thousands of Colombians hit the streets again in the latest round of anti-government protests. At least 59 people have died and over 2,300 have been injured in the unrest so far. The demonstrations, now in their second month, resumed amid a stalemate in talks between the government and the protest leaders. The two sides reached a so-called pre-agreement, but the protest leaders accused the government of backtracking. The government says the protest leaders need to condemn the roadblocks. Meanwhile, the country's defense ministry said the security forces gradually lifted some blockades, but 38 remain. Defendants of the volcano eruption tragedy in New Zealand have demanded more time to enter pleas. The defendants took the Whakatane district court that they did not have enough time to go through all of the evidence provided. The surprise volcano eruption killed 22 people and injured many others at the White Islands in 2019. The dead mostly include tourists from the US, Australia and Malaysia on board a cruise ship that was sailing to the area of the event. New Zealand's workspace regulator, WorkSafe, filed charges against 13 parties that took 47 tourists to the island last year. They were charged for not meeting health and safety obligations while taking tourists to the island. Sri Lanka says it is prepared for the possibility of an oil spill after a cargo ship loaded with chemicals sank off its western coast. The MV Express Pearl was anchored off the Colombo port when a fire erupted on board after an explosion on May 20. The ship's operators, Express Feeders, said in a statement there were still no signs of a fuel oil spill. They said much of the toxic cargo had been incinerated in the fire, but photos from the state's coast guard show a layer of green film blanketing the ocean surrounding the vessel. Sri Lanka has banned fishing along an 80-kilometer stretch of coast. The government has said it would seek redress for the incident following the international law. It's time for a short break. We'll be back with more stories. Stay tuned. Welcome back. NASA has announced plans to launch 2 scientific missions to Venus between 2028 and 2030. They aim to study the atmosphere and geologic history of Earth's closest planetary neighbor. The 2 missions, dubbed Da Vinci Plus and Veritas, are NASA's first to Venus in decades. The U.S. Space Agency says it is awarding around $500 million for each mission. According to NASA, Da Vinci Plus will measure the composition of the dense Venusian atmosphere. It is also expected to return the first high-resolution images of unique geological features that are comparable with Earth. Meanwhile, Veritas will map the planet's surface to help determine its geological history. China has successfully launched the first of a new generation of meteorological satellite into its planned orbit. The satellite Fangyun 4B was hurled on a Long March 3B rocket from the Xinjiang Center in Sichuan province. It will be used in weather analysis and forecasting, as well as environmental and disaster monitoring. Its observation range covers Asia, the Central Pacific Ocean, and the Indian Ocean regions. The launch marks the 372nd flight mission of the Long March rocket series. Lego employees have built the world's largest football out of toy bricks at Lego House in Billund, Denmark. CEO Jesper Vilstrup said football combines two major passions, soccer and Lego. The giant ball was built using more than 173,000 bricks and took almost 150 hours to complete. Designed by Søren Hansen Henge, the football weighs 2.5 tons. It is over 4 meters high and composed of 75 modules in black and white. All employees, including the cleaners, designers, kitchen staff, and the CEO, contributed to building the ball. Everyone will be able to access the Lego Square and take a look at the ball for free until the Euro 2020 final on July 11. And now the business updates. Crude oil prices have hit a 2-year high, with Brent crude rising above the $71 per barrel mark. This comes after OPEC and its allies decided to stick to the plan to gradually restore supply. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude futures are trading above $68 per barrel. The OPEC Plus meeting last 20 minutes, the quickest in the grouping's history. It suggested strong compliance among members and conviction the demand will recover after the pandemic. OPEC Plus data shows demand will be 99.8 million barrels per day by the end of the year versus 97.5 million BPD. Britain says it is seeking to strike a trade agreement with Australia by mid-June following another round of bilateral talks. In a news briefing, British envoy to Australia said an accord will be signed during a meeting of the two premiers on 15th of June. Vicky Treadle added that the deal will add over $700 million to the British economic output. Britain is pursuing a deal with Australia as one of the pillars of its post-Brexit strategy. The proposed agreement is the most advanced of several deals being pursued by London. The Wall Street stocks have declined as the market continued to struggle to reach a new all-time high amid speculative trading. The investors also shrugged off better than expected labor market data. New claims for jobless benefits have dropped below 400,000 for the first time since COVID-19 pandemic started. The indices of S&P 500 and Nasdaq Composite traded nearly 1% low, while DJI was also down marginally. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News.